So welcome, and I very much look forward to introducing you to our first speaker. So it's an honor to introduce Professor Kevin Dawson. He is a historian of the African diaspora at the University of California, Merced. His scholarship considers how enslaved Africans recreated and reimagined Atlantic African maritime traditions, including swimming, surfing, underwater diving, canoe making, canoeing, and fishing. These traditions made captives exploited lives more bearable by providing them with a sense of cultural continuity, meaning, and belonging. Kevin Dawson has published articles and a book on this topic, including Enslaved Swimmers and Divers in the Atlantic World in the Journal of American History in 2006, Enslaved Ship Pilots in the Age of Revolutions in the Journal of Social History in 2013, and a phenomenal book, The Undercurrents of Power, Aquatic Culture in the African Diaspora in 2018, which received the Harriet Tubman Prize from the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. The story that he will be telling today explores the aquatic history and culture of enslaved Africans in the Americas. So I'm going to pass the mic over to Kevin. Excited to hear the story.
Hi, thanks for the introduction, Mae-ling. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the ability to be here. So today I'm just going to give kind of an overview of my work to situate Africans, African descended people in the Atlantic world, and to highlight some of their connections with water and also with the trees that they used to forge dugout canoes. So water informs human experiences throughout much of Atlantic Africa, where most people lived near water. Stretching from Senegal to Angola, Atlantic Africa is rimmed by thousands of miles of coastline, bisected by rivers and streams that watered the roots of silk cotton trees. Here, Africans formed intimate relationships with water during work and personal time, regarding it as a social, cultural, and political space. Societies were not dichotomized into discrete terrestrial and maritime worlds. Instead, people equally understood land and water. Many were fishing farmers and farming fishermen who wove terrestrial and aquatic experiences into amphibious lives, interlacing spiritual and secular beliefs, economies, social structures, political institutions, their very way of life around relationships with water. African dugout canoes embodied and expressed generational wisdom and were ingrained with social, cultural, spiritual, and political meaning. They were companions and collaborators, as well as community members, transporting canoeists safely across liquid expanses, returning them home with fish and incomes. Throughout Africa, canoe making was widely deemed a sacred profession, with dugouts treated as sacred and secular objects, reflected in the Senegambian proverb, "The blood of kings and the tears of canoe makers are sacred things that must never touch the ground." A canoe's value was not solely determined by construction cost. It was determined by its ability to produce incomes, safeguard mariners, and embody and articulate community valuations. Spiritual motifs carved in high and low relief articulated canoes' relationships with water and spirits residing therein, affording spiritual guidance to mariners in quest of fish, markets, and safe passages. Cottonwoods coupled the here and now to the spirit world. Over 100 feet tall, they had a soul and connected heavens, earth, and water. Their spreading branches and buttress roots embraced the sky and earth. The trunks housed the souls of future generations waiting to be born, as Chinua Achebe expressed in his fictional representation of Igbo life. Thus, members of many African-descended communities on both sides of the Atlantic world performed spiritual ceremonies under the embrace of their spreading canopy. Canoes had a gender, and the soul of the trees they were carved from continued to reside in their hull. Canoemen formed personal and spiritual bonds with dugouts. Fanti mariners from Ghana performed welcoming ceremonies that included placing food offerings on them. Jonkan people from inland Nigeria called newly purchased canoes their bride and similarly made offerings to them. Honors continued throughout a canoe's life. Canoemen and women regularly fed and made sacrifices to dugouts, so their soul would guide and protect them. Well-treated canoes guided fishermen and women to schools of fish, telling them when to cast nets, and helped merchants evade pirates. Water was a sacred space populated by deities and spirits, with many believing the realm of the dead lay at the bottom or across the ocean or other large waterways. Water channeled one's soul across the Kalunga, the permeable divide between the living and the dead, to the supernatural world, where it was reunited with ancestors waiting to be reborn. To facilitate this voyage, members of many communities buried the dead with a small canoe to facilitate the journey. Swimming was part of many people's daily life, transforming water into a mystical medium, permitting swimmers to glide weightlessly through liquid infinities as body and water slipped into fluid motion. Africans treated swimming as a life skill and method of personal cleanliness, devising efficient techniques for traversing surface and submarine strata. Sources indicate that many mothers taught their children to swim after they were weaned, after they learned to walk at about 10 to 14 months old, or after they were weaned at approximately 2 to 3 years of age. After teaching children the fundamentals, parents promoted expertise through play. Bawari Brinch, who was raised along the Niger River in what is now Mali, explained that the Bobo held swimming in high regard, while his, quote, father and mother delighted in my vivacity and agility, end quote. Many societies affix spirituality to gliding through this potentially dangerous element, creating charms to safeguard against drowning and marine creatures, with Brinch's father giving him a protective ornament, quote unquote. Safeguarded by prowess, ambulance, and buddy systems, parents encouraged children to explore their liquid worlds. Many coastal children began surfing when roughly 5 years old, transforming turbulence into thrilling playgrounds. Youth learned about surf zones by seeing and feeling the ocean, push and pull their bodies. At Elmina, a Dutch traveler observed, quote, several hundred boys and girls sporting together before the beach, and in many places among the rolling and breaking waves, learning to swim and surf, end quote, concluding that Africans' dexterity, quote, proceed from their being brought up, both men and women from their infancy, to swim like fish, end quote. Throughout their lives, many Africans honed their aquatic fluency using the breaststroke, side stroke, backstroke, and crawl or freestyle. Virtually every European traveler was amazed by Africans' abilities. In 1455, a Venetian merchant adventurer relayed that those living around the Senegal River, quote, are the most expert swimmers in the world, end quote. Likewise, in the 1590s, a Dutchman described Gold Coast Africans' use of the crawl, writing, quote, they can swim amazingly fast, generally easily outdoing people of our nation in swimming and underwater diving, end quote. Canoes and Africans' wet bodies enabled individuals and societies to forge bonds with ancestral spirits and deities. Communicating with ancestors and other spirits was part of daily life, with water being a catalyst for doing so. Thus, churning the muddy waters of broad rivers, suspending their bodies in the Atlantic's brine, surfing a wave, or skimming across the surface in dugouts, enabled Africans to intimately connect with sacred waters, aquatic deities, and ancestral spirits. People from Senegal to South Africa and as far inland as Mali believed in deities that were half woman, half fish, with Mamiwata being the most celebrated of these fin deities. Shape-shifting between a woman and half woman, half fish, Mamiwata slipped between discrete elements and circumstances, between water and earth, the real and surreal, the present and the future. She safeguarded followers from drowning and rewarded them with enhanced spiritual understandings, good health, and success. Most closely associated with the Yoruba of Nigeria and Benin, she was carried to the Americas by the early 1700s, with enslaved Africans. Europeans realized they could benefit from Africans' understandings of or African underwater diving aptitudes and sought members of ethnic groups known to possess skilled aquanauts. During the 1540s, before the English crafted concepts of race and slavery, Jacques Francis, John Ike, George Black, and 5 other unnamed African divers were hired by a Venetian salvager named Pietro Corsi to salvage Henry VIII's flagship, the Mary Rose. While preparing to engage an attacking French fleet on July 19th, 1545, the Rose sank off Portsmouth, England, with her deck lying about 40 feet below the surface. The English Navy unsuccessfully sought to refloat the Rose before hiring Corsi in 1546, and as Italian divers were considered the best European salvagers. The Africans were born on Aguin Island off Mauritania, where they had salvaged many European wrecks. Arguin was seasonally inhabited by Wolof-speaking fishermen from Senegal. The divers were probably Labu, an aquacultural ethnic group that was part of the Wolof ethnic language group. Corsi apparently learned of their success salvaging wrecks in the region and hired them in 1545 to work other wrecks off England. Francis then became the head diver, while Ike and Black were divers and the other Africans were apparently apprentices. All were well treated, with Corsi, quote, paying for their meat and drink at the Dolphin Inn in Hampton. For the African divers, England would have confirmed African beliefs about the spirit realm being across the ocean. The Mary Rose's anti-boarding netting trapped most of the 400 crew members aboard and prevented large marine creatures from eating them. Thus, the divers would have encountered intact skeletal remains in murky 50-degree waters that were far colder than any they had previously experienced, perhaps convincing them that they had entered the spirit world. England's built and social environments would have been incredibly unfamiliar for them. The architecture, food, many of the animals, and white women would have all been new. The Dolphin Inn's second floor served as a brothel, with the structure and sexual encounters surely informing the divers' perceptions of England. The divers were never enslaved and salvaged several wrecks in English and presumably other European waters before vanishing from the historical record. However, their mark was enduring. The Mary Rose made the divers famous while introducing the English to African salvaging techniques. Africans and swimming were novelties in 16th century England, and crowds gathered upon Portsmouth waterfront to watch the divers part the English brine and land recovered goods upon its wharves. Importantly, the divers caused the English to realize that salvaging did not have to be limited to English shipwrecks. Swift, agile divers inspired colonists to furtively plunder sunken Spanish treasure ships. The English recovery of the Spanish treasure ship, Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, was an important salvaging event that had far-reaching repercussions. In 1641, the Concepcion sank in 60 feet of water off what is now known as Silver Bank, off the coast of Hispaniola. In 1686, English colonists from Massachusetts, Bermuda, Barbados, Jamaica, South Carolina, Antigua, and the Bahamas colluded to strip the Concepcion, employing roughly 60 enslaved African divers. The white salvagers knew the wreck's general location, but needed to find her, searching the area unsuccessfully for 6 weeks, sending down divers whenever dark objects were spotted against the Caribbean's white sand bottom. On January 20th, 1687, 3 African-born divers who had been enslaved in Barbados, named John Pasqua, Francis Anderson, and Jonas Ambalik, arrived with a silk cottonwood dugout. Remarkably, they found the Concepcion, quote, within 2 hours, end quote, spotting bronze cannons and 2 sealed bottles of champagne in 40 feet of water. Unfortunately, accounts do not reveal the divers' ethnicity or how they perceived their success, with the silence inviting speculation. They surely felt their dugout communicated with ancestral spirits and deities to guide them to the wreck. Before drinking the champagne, the men conceivably poured a libation into the sea to honor their ancestors and onto the canoe's bow to thank its soul. Enslaved salvage divers exchanged their wisdom, expertise, and abilities to generate spectacular amounts of wealth and capital for unique privileges, with the Concepcion divers raising 36 tons of silver and gold in a few weeks, valued at approximately $4 billion in today's currency. Divers' unique privileges hinged on what is now called free diving, or diving with only the air in one's lungs. Divers spent years honing their minds and bodies to meet underwater challenges, like learning to prevent blackouts caused by rapid changes in underwater pressure. Just as modern athletes benefit from training at high altitudes, medical research suggests the physiology of enslaved divers adapted to repeated prolonged submersion, water pressure, and oxygen deprivation by, among other things, slowing their metabolism, enabling them to more efficiently consume oxygen, and sharpening their underwater vision by up to twice the normal range. Indeed, a Dutch merchant adventurer who traveled to Africa and the Caribbean during the 1590s reported on these physiological changes, saying Gold Coast Africans, quote, can keep themselves underwater for a long time. They can dive amazingly far and can see well underwater, end quote. Most of these divers could hold their breath 2 to 3 minutes, and a rare few 4. Most were treated like highly skilled craftsmen, receiving both wages and shares or a percentage of salvaged goods, enabling many to become wealthy even while enslaved, with some purchasing their freedom and that of their family members. Divers' value was not measured by the duration of their labor, but by the goods they raised during brief moments beneath the sea. Receiving both even as terrestrial bondage compelled captives to spend the majority of their day toiling for enslavers, aquanauts dove less than 2 hours per day and performed no other work while salvaging. For instance, Bermudian diver John Locke, who worked the Concepcion, received 2,400 silver coins as his share, using his profits to purchase his freedom and that of his sister Betty and her son Jethro, as well as a ship, a boat, and a house. Likewise, 5 African-born divers from Barbados named Kezar, Salisbury, Tom, Tony, and head diver Bomko received similar shares. Importantly, enslaved Africans recreated aquatic traditions to maintain bonds with home communities and provide their exploited lives with a sense of meaning, purpose, and belonging. Along riverbanks and Caribbean and Atlantic shores, captives transplanted and reimagined African beach cultures. In the evening, after spending most of their time working for enslavers, many field hands slipped into the water to cool off, relax, and wash away the day's trouble. For example, Bill Crump, who had been enslaved in North Carolina during the 19th century, recalled, quote, "We worked in the field from sunup to sundown most of the time, but had a couple hours of at dinner time to slip into the water to swim." For enslaved women, water took on new meanings and usages, as it could be a sanctuary in the midst of plantation cruelty. Enslaved women understood how white men objectified their bodies, knowing rape could be their cruel rite of passage into womanhood. On land, women's ability to escape sexual exploitation was limited. Water and aquatic expertise permitted women to non-violently thwart white male aggression. As Englishman Cedric Williams and a group of non-swimming male companions toured Jamaica in 1823, they paused to covetously watch 20 nude African-born women as they recreated African aquatic traditions with, quote, some washing clothes, some washing themselves, while others swam about like nereids, end quote. When the voyeurs were discovered, the, quote, women on shore dashed into the water. When they were far enough from our masculine gaze, they popped their heads above the water as they laughed and made fun of us, end quote. Emboldened by the men's inability to swim, the women flaunted their sexuality, alluring the non-swimming men to swim out and fulfill their sexual cravings. They seductively glided through waters that silhouetted their nude bodies. distorting the intimate details, as they provocatively sang a song about a white male preacher who, quotes, crossed the sea to make love to enslaved women. William thinly veiled his sexual desires, dubbing the song's composer Proserpine, a Greek goddess who had been raped by Hades. For the femme fatales, Jamaican waters were an empowering refuge, allowing them to retain control of their nude bodies, even as men a few feet away sought to sexually dominate them. In closing, even as the Atlantic slave trade forcibly transplanted enslaved Africans to the Americas, it created a cultural watershed, funneling aquatic traditions to the Americas for generations. This permitted the enslaved to recreate and reimagine traditions that enabled captives to maintain cultural bonds with home communities that they were stolen from, providing their exploited lives with a sense of meaning, purpose, and belonging, while permitting people to enjoy their bodies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That was amazing. I have really appreciated the opportunity to be able to speak and chat with Kevin over a few months, and I'm going to. We've already had a few comments in the chat already, but I'm going to encourage people to kind of submit your questions, and I sort of bring them up. But to start, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, just generally speaking, imaginaries and narratives of the enslaved have historically been terror-centric. Imagine these worlds in fields, in plantations, and your scholarship sort of fills a gap, and as you shift towards the aquatic traditions of the enslaved, can you share a story of what prompted you to look towards these maritime histories that aren't widely sort of lesser known maritime history?
I don't think it was actually one thing that caused me to if actually, I guess if I were to say like kind of one account or one story that caused me to shift, it might have been Olado Equiano's narrative where he talks about swimming, and where he's enslaved in the interior of Nigeria, and as he's brought presumably to the Niger River, he sees all of these Africans swimming, and he's amazed because he doesn't really know how to swim. And he sees all these people. And so that, I think, in many ways shifted my perspective. But before that, I had actually kind of been shifting. My perspective had been shifted. I mean, I guess part of it is I grew up in Southern California, but then also have roots in New York and Southern Louisiana. And so I was aware of these perceptions that Black people don't swim. And I grew up swimming and surfing. I don't know if I said that or not, but I grew up swimming and surfing in South LA County. And so I mean, for myself, I had these abilities, but then I also understood these kind of broader cultural perspectives. And so what began to shift my understanding, or how, like, to think, wait, maybe there's this kind of cultural heritage that we don't really recognize, was that as I was kind of working as an early grad student, I began to come across a number of accounts of enslaved people in the United States and the Caribbean doing things that today we might think of as un-Black, like of swimming, and not just swimming, but being really strong swimmers and being underwater divers. And then looking to Africa and finding accounts of Africans canoeing and fishing and swimming and things, and later finding accounts of African surfing. So it was in many ways a gradual process, but then also I think Equiano's account was this kind of pivotal shift where I realized that, wait, this isn't just like kind of these fragments, but that there's many people who were doing this.
Yes. Actually, I have it came up in the chat, and you just brought it up right now. Myth that Black people don't swim, and their contemporary swimming practices, like statistics show that many drownings and also people representation within sports is really sort of not very strong with black folks. And so we're wondering, the question comes up, we're wondering where, and this is from the Q&A, we're wondering where, why, how modern and contemporary contemporary lies, myths and beliefs about Black people not being able to swim, or even Black bodies not being able to float, have been perpetuated. Where along the way was it deemed urgent to tell this lie? And how was it made so believable? Feeling grateful for this abundant history of our fertility, joy, and talent in water, feeling affirmed and happy for the historical contextualization, wondering where, why, how modern and contemporary. Yeah. Sorry, I'm here. I'm breaking up. Were you able to get all of that?
Yeah, I could hear a little bit of it. Yeah, I think as when you lean in, it breaks up. You break up a little bit. But yeah, I got that. So, it would, if we look at historical counts, I mean, they typically show that people of African descent were much stronger swimmers than people of European descent. And Europeans largely stopped swimming during the Middle Ages. And so you have these accounts of Africans being, again, these much stronger swimmers, underwater divers, really into the early 20th century. And there's a few things that end up unsettling that, if you will, or kind of driving Black people off of waterways. First is the segregation of swimming pools. Swimming pools began to be built, public swimming pools in the United States and Europe in the 1880s. And they were first kind of gender segregated. So you had pools for men and women, and they were places where people would go, kind of the working class would go and kind of swim about, but then primarily bathe. And then in the 19-teens, white families wanted to recreate at pools. And so then they began to be racially segregated. So you could have a place for white families to go and then Black families. And then these, for every like maybe 20 pools that was built for white people, one would be built for Black people. At the same time, you had the rise of beach culture. And what that did is that Black people had been recreating at beaches along the ocean, along lakes and rivers. And as white Americans, and then also in the Caribbean, I mean, the same thing, but as white people saw beaches as places to recreate, they began to force Black people off and oftentimes use racial violence. And so, yeah, I mean, and then many of these waterways actually became the final resting places of people who had been lynched or otherwise were the victims of murdered as the victims of racial violence. So the myths and the perceptions that the question raised, those really, like, I mean, you have a lot of these myths that, like, the slave trade or kind of historical memories, these historical memories
Generational trauma.
Yeah, of generational trauma, they begin to emerge in the 1950s, really the 1960s, where it seems like a kind of a response. So you have Black people forced out of off of waterways. They begin to lose their ability to swim. There's not a lot of historical kind of discussions of this, or at least none that I have found. And then in the 1950s, 1960s, as Black people are more likely to drown, then you begin to see the creation of these myths where, the slave trade created trauma, or these beliefs that enslavers used water as a form of punishment. And then the myth about Black people being less buoyant, that actually came about as a white response. I mean, so Black people were far more likely to drown, and the medical profession recognized this, that they're 6 to 10 times more likely to drown. And so then you had actually university studies where professors and doctors were making these claims that Black people's bones were denser, and therefore Black people were less buoyant than white Americans. And so those begin to kind of develop as kind of a non-racial explanation for, or I shouldn't say a non-racial, it let white Americans sidestep kind of racism as being a cause of the high drowning rate and say, no, it's Black people's bodies that causes them to drown at these disproportionately high rates.
Thank you. Yeah. Huh. That's really fascinating how these stories come about and how they sort of are perpetuated. The the research in general, like how do you, can you speak to some of the challenges in this research you've been doing? It covers like part of history where we have so little knowledge, and just wondering if can you speak a little bit to the challenges you might face?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the challenges has been that as historians, I mean, so as we're trying to understand enslaved people's African heritage, there's been this kind of shift to studying particular ethnic groups. So tracing the ethnic traditions of, say, one group, or like the Fanti, the Asante, or maybe larger language cultural groups like Akan, who the Fanti and the Asante are part of, out of Africa into the Americas. And that's been really productive because we have been able to trace then to better understand how people imagined and recreated traditions. And so it might be a study that would trace, the Akan people to Jamaica, or the Akan people to South Carolina. And so for studying kind of terrestrial or land-based traditions, that's been really fruitful. For understanding water, it hasn't been, because, if I took that approach, you don't have the kind of concentrations that would allow me to make those kind of deep intellectual dives, excuse the pun, for recreating or for seeing how captives recreated their kind of diving traditions. And so I had to make this really broad, or my scope had to be really broad as far as time and space, and basically going from 1444, when the Portuguese first sailed into sub-Saharan Africa, to 1888, when Brazil became the last country to abolish slavery in the Americas.
I have another question from Henry. Is Kevin a Ghanaian? Is he aware that the majority of enslaved persons taken into the New World were not coastal people, but inland people were not familiar with the culture or like related to the oceans?
So no, I'm not Ghanaian. But I am very familiar with like kind of the patterns of where people were taken from. And I think the thing to keep in mind is that if we look at, like, even when we looked at Africa now, or the Caribbean now, or the United States now, the swimming traditions that we see now, or the non-swimming traditions that we see now, have been ruptured by the slave trade and by colonialism. So if we look at the historical records, even for inland people, we do see that many of them were very proficient swimmers, whether we're looking at the accounts of Africa or the Americas. I mean, Europeans were looking for African skills that they could exploit in the Americas. And so, whether you're talking, I mean, there's accounts as far inland as Timbuktu that describe Africans as being very proficient swimmers. I mean, there's accounts of for instance, the Asante at Lake Busumtwi being very proficient swimmers, or up the Volta River of Africans. So again, I mean, we can't look at like kind of today and think that what we're seeing today represents what was going on in the past. I mean, actually, one thing I would say, just kind of, I think one thing that kind of, I mean, if we're thinking about this and like what's causing people to drown, it's and this is, I'm painting with a very broad brush here, but it's in many ways kind of, if we're looking at Africa, Western Christian values. So traditionally, it was fine for Africans to swim nude. Now, many people do not have a bathing suit. And so that discourages people from swimming. And so I know that sounds very a kind of a superficial, maybe brush off of how we of why people in the interior can't swim. But I've actually been doing a lot of kind of public facing work to promote swimming. And some of the things that we've found is that just by bringing bathing suits and goggles to African descended communities, that can really help promote swimming, because of these, like, you know, people just don't have access to these things, and that's preventing them from swimming.
Right, access is a huge thing in the Caribbean also, that comes up about, you know, why many people maybe in coastal spaces don't have access to this, don't swim, even fishermen, as tourism has, you know, taken up a lot of the coastal spaces, and, you know, with limiting access and to local people. But I have another question I'd like to try and fit in. Thank you for that wonderful, rich presentation. I know you have spent quite a lot of time on the Ghanaian coast and elsewhere. What typologies or changes between the architecture of dugout canoes made by the enslaved have you noticed? How would you compare them to contemporary dugout canoe design?
Yeah, so the dugout, okay, so the dugout canoes, I mean, if we're talking about the coastal canoes, I mean, these are surf canoes. So these are going to be different than kind of a more traditional canoe that you might see inland, where you basically, I mean, on these coastal canoes, it's a dugout canoe, if people aren't familiar, and it's reinforced to prevent it from breaking apart. They're actually carved and then cut in half lengthwise, and a keel is inserted to strengthen it, and then the sides are raised up. And so importantly, Africans had developed these types of canoes. I mean, very early European accounts from like the 1400s document these canoes. But if you look at accounts, you can see that in the 1600s, as the slave trade is really ramping up, the size of these canoes, Africans made these canoes much bigger. So traditionally they had been in maybe the 15 to 20 foot range, and then they became larger to the 25 to 30 foot range. And so they looked, I mean, from descriptions, they look very much like the canoes that you see today, whether you're in Senegal or in Ghana or, you know, elsewhere. They look very similar according to accounts. I mean, there's very few drawings of them, but the descriptions indicate that they're very similar. The canoes that Africans made in the Americas are almost identical. I mean, if you look at the descriptions of what they're making, whether it's a more traditional canoe without the sides built up, but in the Caribbean and in like Brazil, tropical regions where there were silk cottonwood trees, Africans were making these very same surf canoes that they had been making in tropical Africa, where they had access to silk cottonwood trees, and where they didn't have access to silk cottonwood trees, like further inland, people were making them with mahogany. And then in the Americas, they're making them with other types of wood, cypress, pine, I should say in North America, excuse me. But the canoes, you see the changes in kind of design. Briefly, just to recap, in the 1600s in Africa, and then these enslaved Africans bring kind of mental blueprints with them to the Americas, and they're created very much the same as they had been.
Thank you. And there is one more from Antonella Pelissari, fascinated with Kevin's stories and tales that were narrated against colonial history. This is one issue I struggle with, how to write a visual counter history during enslavement and colonization. I would be curious to discuss this project on oral history can help.
Sorry, you broke up a little bit there, but I mean, so as far as like, yeah, so I caught some of it anyway.
Sorry, would you like me to repeat? And it's also in the chat here. From Antonella Pelissari, I was fascinated with Kevin's stories and tales that were narrated against colonial imagery. This is one issue I struggle with. How to write a visual counter history during enslavement and colonization.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I see it. So I mean, it is the problem. I mean, we very much, if you're studying early modern Africa, if you're studying the slave experience, very much having to rely on these kind of colonial records, the records of slave traders and merchants. And so, I mean, part of it, I think part of the challenge is, yes, we do have to use those sources. We can shift through the racism. I mean, because they are documenting things accurately. I mean, there is this kind of racism that they're embedded in, that the understandings are kind of wrapped in. And so if we strip those away, we can get a pretty good sense of kind of the culture and spiritual beliefs. And then oral history is very much, those can very much bolster our understandings. I mean, they very much can fill in the gap. So whether I'm using ethnohistory or conducting field research, I mean, in many ways, if you go, I mean, oftentimes when I've done field research in the Caribbean or in Africa, people are doing things in many of the same ways that they had been doing them for centuries. And so you can very much rely, I think, on those sorts of things. I mean, the canoe making techniques, while they're using power tools now throughout West Africa, I mean, you can still get a very good sense of how these canoes were made, of what their designs look like, of the architecture of them, before they've been painted, what they look like, and how they're assembled and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I have in my own work and research, spending time in fishing communities, have encountered a few dugout canoes, for example, which I wasn't aware, of their connection to African histories until reading your book, and it sort of changed the landscape, the material landscape of fishing, even fish traps, which I've been interested in the shapes. Where someone from the city, wasn't exposed to, even though I grew up in Jamaica, wasn't exposed to this sort of material culture around fishing, and it's amazing that how much of that kind of stays with us today. And I think we are pretty close to time, but I was just thinking of if there were other visual traces or other traces of material culture that we can kind of, we have the canoe and the dugout, but are there other traces that we can kind of point back to, this period, maritime history of the enslaved? And then one to tack on, Nari Ward is asking if you can speak about the cowrie shells as currency in their initial scarcity linked to their value. So it's sort of like a two-part question, or a material question, I suppose.
Yeah. So I mean, going to the material question, I mean, I mean, you definitely see kind of the well, I guess one way is what material you're looking at. So one other thing that I would say is, like, I mean, looking at the descriptions of, say, swimming, to try and understand the techniques that Africans are using. I mean, we do have written descriptions, and then we do have drawings of African swimming. And so you can see in that, where there would be no kind of evidence left, right? They're not making something. But you can definitely see that Africans are using a kind of this overarm stroke, where they're bringing their arm. You can see the high elbow of the crawl being used, even though Europeans make claims, or people of European descent make claims of inventing the crawl, the Australian crawl, right, in the 1880s. You can see that Africans are doing it well before then. But you can also see it. I mean, it's a little bit harder to see in the American South, but for example, if you go to coastal South Carolina, Georgia, among the Gullah Geechee people, you can see the same types of fish traps and canoes have been created for generation upon generation. And so people describe that. I mean, I've interviewed people there who describe making these sorts of of fish traps and canoes, and in the same ways that had been made under slavery, according to those written accounts, and then also in Africa. So yeah, so the cowrie shells, so it depends with, so cowrie shells are a little bit maybe tricky because they were harvested in the southern, they're not indigenous to, or my understanding is that they're not indigenous to all of Atlantic Africa, to the kind of Angola region, and then the Indian Ocean. And so they're really only, and so that's what makes them scarce. And so many of the cowrie shells, if you're talking about, say Ghana, for example, or Senegal, where they're used as a form of currency, there were no local collections of them, but women, what labor was gendered, and women in Angola were the divers who harvested them. That was women's work. And so that was that was a way for women to kind of leverage their expertise. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Is there anything else out there people had questions about? Okay. Yeah, I'm thinking about, how we connect Catherine chairs. It's incredible how much unlearning is necessary to understand African diasporic peoples. The whole notion of the waterways were actually our inheritance and not something we separate from is revelatory. Thank you for that, Catherine. But yeah, it's the sort of misconceptions and the disconnection that people kind of place with of Black people not being able to, and so on, makes this research completely fascinating. And we're super grateful that you're here to kind of make these connections. It's been incredibly useful in trying to help me understand my own cultural heritage, which we don't often get to kind of, one has to kind of go seeking for on their own, because it's not sort of built in within education as well, when I was growing up, at least here in Jamaica. So super grateful for you for filling these sort of historical gaps and sort of centering aquatics in African descended people's lives. As as you mentioned earlier, as a surfer myself, this is kind of where it first comes up when you travel out to different places around the world and you realize you're the only Black person in the water, like what, and then to kind of have this history it's very, yeah, I was just super excited to be able to connect with it in this way, this research and work. So I just wanted to thank you so much for, all the scholarship that you've done. And yeah, and I think if we don't have any last questions, I think we can, do you have anything coming up that you'd like to just talk about, or before?
Well, I look forward, and sorry, I think my internet connection is breaking up too, or I'm having some problems.
Sorry.
But I definitely look forward to working with you, to continue to work with you. And I am developing this online, and Simon knows, visual archive of that documents African and African aquatics in Africa and African diaspora. So yeah, I think people should keep an eye out for that, because I do think that will be a good resource for people.
I think it would be a wonderful cross-platform, could be a wonderful cross-platform experience. But thank you. Mae-ling, or MC, is back in the room. So let me take it from there. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Simon.